The dry wind blew across the dead fields of Garces III, where the sun no longer gave life, only heat and silence. The soil was cracked and useless, poisoned from the orbital strikes months ago. No food grew anymore. Lyra crouched low inside the shell of a ruined grain silo, clutching a broken ration cube that was barely enough for one child, let alone two. Her daughter Nala and little son Rix lay under a tattered blanket beside her, their small bodies thin and shaking, too tired to cry. Their eyes no longer held fear, only hunger and fading light. Lyra had once been a teacher before the war. She knew numbers, history, how to build futures. The future had been stolen the day the Coalition declared Earth colonies unfit to govern themselves. They came with shiny ships and cold orders, stripped the humans of their rights, banned farming, seized food supplies, and forced those who remained into hard labor camps. Lyra worked in the fields from dawn till dusk, harvesting food that was shipped off-world while her own children starved. Her pay was measured in tokens, and tokens were never enough. She begged. She pleaded, but the guards just laughed or looked away. That day, as the sun beat down harder than usual, and Nala asked if she could eat the dust because her belly ached, something in Lyra broke. She wrapped her children in what cloth she had left, kissed their foreheads, and told them to stay hidden, no matter what. Then she walked straight into the Coalition labor compound, past sneering alien guards and other hopeless workers. Her hair was tangled, her lips cracked, and her steps slow, but her eyes held a fire no hunger could kill. When the towering Zaxxari guard blocked her path and told her to leave, she didn't. She looked up at him and said clearly, "My children are starving. I'll work your fields, your machines. I'll even warm your bed. Just feed them." Room went quiet. Sithar officer behind a glowing desk leaned forward, surprised. "You offer your labor and your body? For food?" She didn't blink. "Yes, whatever you need. Just let them eat." Yeah. The officer clicked his claws together, then approved 6 meal tokens. 6 enough for 3 days if she rationed carefully. It wasn't mercy, it was a transaction. But it would keep her children alive. She took the tokens, bowed once without a word, and walked away. Her back stayed straight, even as tears burned her eyes. She didn't cry because of shame. She cried because hunger had made her invisible, and now it had made her valuable in the worst way. I had given away all that was left of her pride. And in doing so, she had taken the first step toward something no one expected. In that moment, she didn't know that others would hear of her act. She didn't know her name would spread, whispered in alleys and work camps. She didn't know. She would become a spark. All she knew was that her children would eat tonight, and she would not stop until they never went hungry again. Lyra sat beside the fire pit she had built from scrap metal and cracked stone. Her arms wrapped around Nala and Rix, who finally slept with full bellies. The meal tokens she had earned were gone, spent on tasteless nutrient paste and dry cakes. But it was the first time in weeks her children didn't whimper in their sleep. The wind outside still howled, and the walls of their shelter groaned, but inside was a rare quiet. Her body ached from the field work she had done that day, double shifts under the twin suns. Her skin burned raw, her hands blistered and bleeding, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. Word had spread quickly through the camps after she made her offer. People whispered her name, some with pity, others with judgment, but mostly with awe. They had all thought of doing what she did, giving everything to keep their children alive, but no one had dared. She had become something more than just a mother now. To some, she was a symbol of shame. To others, a symbol of courage. But Lyra didn't care about being a symbol. She cared about food, shelter, and the fragile lives in her arms. The next day, as she returned to the labor compound, a thin woman named Jessa stopped her. Jessa had lost a baby 2 weeks ago and barely spoke since. But now she reached out, eyes wide. "They say they'll give me 3 tokens if I do what you did," she whispered. Lyra's heart dropped. She hadn't meant to open a door like this. "Don't," she said softly. "They'll take everything and give back crumbs." But Jessa just smiled bitterly. "Crumbs are better than burying your child in the sand." More women began doing it. So did some of the men. The guards didn't even pretend to hide it anymore. They set prices like shopkeepers. Labor, services, even affection measured in tokens and controlled by alien hands. The coalition had turned the camp into a silent auction of dignity. Alira tried to keep her head down, work longer hours, earn food the old way. She refused to return to that office, but the problem grew. Fights broke out in the food lines. People began stealing from each other, hiding scraps in boots and behind water tanks. Children were sent alone to beg the guards. One night, a mother found her daughter missing, and in the morning, the girl returned without speaking, her eyes empty. Alira saw the signs. She remembered how her own soul had felt when she first made her offer. She couldn't stand by. So she stood up again. She walked to the loudspeaker post in the center of camp, pulled herself up with shaking arms, and faced the tired, broken crowd. "I gave myself away so my kids could eat," she said, voice rough. "I thought it would save them. I thought it would end with me. But now they want all of you to do it too." Faces turned, silent, waiting. We were never just hungry for food. We were hungry for hope. And now they're feeding on that hunger, feeding on us. Someone asked what they could do. They had no weapons, no leaders, no power. Alira looked. At the hands around her, callous, cracked, trembling but still alive. She said they would build their own food lines, trade among themselves, protect each other. She said no one would go to the guards anymore. If someone fell, the rest would carry them. And if the guards tried to stop it, they'd resist. Fists, tools, rocks, or bare hands. It wasn't a rebellion yet. It was a choice, a beginning. The people around her nodded slowly, then louder, then with clenched fists. That night, for the first time, no one went to the coalition for tokens. And in the silence of refusal, something powerful was born. Not fire, not violence, just unity. And Alira, holding her children close once more, felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not peace, not safety, but purpose. The sun rose slowly over the wasteland of Garcestry, painting the sky in red and gray as smoke curled from distant machine fires. Lyra walked through the labor camp with her chin held high, passing rows of worn-out faces, aching bodies, and eyes filled with questions. Ever since she stood on that speaker post and told the camp to stop begging, something had shifted. People were no longer just surviving, they were watching her, following her, waiting to see if the fire she lit would hold. She didn't feel like a leader. She felt like a mother trying to keep her promise. But she didn't stop. With the help of a few others, she turned the broken supply shelter into a small kitchen. Jessa, who had once whispered of trading herself for tokens, now chopped roots and boiled ration dust into soup thick enough to stretch across 10 bowls. A man named Caro, tall and silent with an old military scar on his neck, used scrap metal to make tools and cook pots. He never spoke much, but he always helped. People began to bring what little they had: dry leaves, bitter weeds cracked. Seed pods, and shared it. They didn't ask for pay. They just nodded and worked. The children ran between the shelters, carrying bowls and messages. Rick's Alira's boy made up a game where he pretended to be a soldier guarding the food, chasing off imaginary guards with a stick. Allah helped the cooks and always made sure the youngest got the first bowl. Hunger didn't disappear, but it lost its power, the coalition guards noticed. At first they laughed, calling it a beggar's festival. But when no one came to trade their bodies for tokens anymore, when the lines at the ration window thinned and the camp's energy rose, the laughter stopped. One morning, 2 guards tore down the kitchen. They kicked the pots, scattered the food, and slammed Jessa into the dirt. When Alira ran to stop them, they struck her hard across the face. She fell, blood in her mouth, the crowd watching in silence. But then a stone flew. It hit one of the guards square in the helmet. Then another came, and another, from all sides. Men, women, even children, throwing whatever they could. The guards fired warning shots, but the crowd didn't scatter. Stood their ground. The guards retreated. It was the first time anyone had pushed back. Later that night, Alira sat beside the broken kitchen, holding a cloth to her bleeding lip. Caro sat beside her and handed her a repaired pot, bent and dented but still usable. "They'll come harder next time," he said quietly. Alira nodded. then we'll stand harder. The people rebuilt the kitchen that same night. They worked with fire in their eyes and pain in their muscles, and no one spoke of stopping. Lyra realized something deeper had changed. The fear was still there, but it was no longer in control. They tasted power. Not the kind with weapons or ships, but the kind that grows when people choose each other over silence. And once it's tasted, it's never forgotten. Days passed. Small rebel acts spread. A group blocked the fuel convoy, demanding medicine. Before they let it through, another planted fake work orders to confuse the guard patrols. Each time the coalition struck back, they struck harder in return. Not with guns, but with unity, cleverness, defiance. Illyra watched it all and knew what was coming. There would be punishment, there would be fire. But she also knew the truth. They had already won something the coalition didn't understand. They had stopped being desperate. They had started being human again. And that, more than anything, was the first real threat the galaxy had ever seen. The night air was heavy with smoke and fear as Illyra sat atop the old water tower. Watching the edge of the horizon where coalition ships had begun to gather, the stars were still there, distant and cold, but now they blinked with the lights of machines preparing to crush what the rebels had built. It had only been a few weeks since the kitchen was rebuilt, but the camp had changed. People moved with purpose. Children no longer cried for food as often. Elders taught others how to mend clothes, fix tools, and hide supplies beneath the sand. Illyra knew their time was short. Every whisper said the same thing. The coalition was angry. And when the coalition grew angry, it didn't punish with whips or words, it punished with fire. That night, as she came down the tower, Caro met her with quiet urgency. A message had arrived, a smuggler drone, damaged, but still working. The message was short. They're coming. Full force.
2 days.
Illyra stared at the blinking red light on the drone's head and felt the old fear return. But it didn't paralyze her like before. It only made her act faster. She gathered everyone at the center of camp, where the cooking fires were still warm. She stood on the same rusted speaker post where her voice had first sparked this resistance. The crowd circled her, silent, waiting. "They'll be here soon," she said, not shouting, just steady, not to scare us, not to control us. To end us. The people didn't flinch. They listened. We can't outgun them. We don't have ships or bombs, but we have each other. And we know this land. We know every tunnel, every ditch, every stone. We know how to hide, how to trick, how to survive. Caro stepped forward with a large bundle. He opened it slowly inside. Were tools, sharpened scraps, metal spikes, broken weapon cores wired into mines. Everything they had salvaged. It's everything they could fight with. Illyra looked at the people again. "I'm not asking you to die," she said. "I'm asking you to live so loud they can't ignore us. I'm asking you to defend the children, the old, the ones who gave everything and got nothing back. I'm asking you to show them what hunger taught us." They nodded, one by one, then all at once. In the hours that followed, the camp turned into a hive. Traps were planted under the sand. Fake power signals were rigged to confuse enemy sensors. Sharp wires stretched between old posts to catch low-flying drones. The food was hidden underground. The children were moved into the deepest parts of the broken mining tunnels. Everyone had a job. No one stood still. Illyra barely slept. Moved from group to group, checking weapons, sharpening blades, whispering courage into shaking hands. And when dawn came, painting the sky in gold and fire, she stood at the front gate with Caro and the other fighters. The horizon shimmered. With approaching dusk, the enemy was close. Behind her, the camp was quiet but ready. She didn't know who would survive. She didn't know what tomorrow would look like. But she knew one thing with perfect clarity. The coalition would no longer see nameless beggars. They would see humans. They would see parents. They would see fire. And that would be enough to shake the stars. The ground began to shake before the ships even touched down. Illyra stood at the front of the camp with Caro beside her, both of them still, faces set like stone, as a cloud of dust and wind rolled toward them. The coalition dropships roared. Overhead black beasts with blinking lights and grinding engines send. They stopped above the camp like shadows, ready to crush everything below. The first one landed hard, sending out a pulse that knocked loose stones across the ground. Its door hissed open, and out marched rows of soldiers in cold armor, their visors glowing blue, weapons raised. But the rebels didn't run. They didn't scream. They stood exactly where they had trained, lined behind makeshift barriers of scrap and sandbags, holding sharpened tools, slings, wires, and courage. For a long moment, the wind was the only sound. Then the commander stepped forward, tall and insect-like, his voice flat and sharp as he read out a warning: surrender immediately or be erased. Illyra stepped forward alone, dust swirling around her torn clothes and sunburnt face. She didn't carry a weapon, only her voice. "This is our home," she said. "We are not your machines. We are not your cattle. You will not take our children. You will not take our food. You will not take our future." The commander raised a hand. The line of soldiers aimed. But before the order could be given, the ground beneath them exploded. The rebels had placed mines under the main path, and now the air filled with flame, sand, and screams. The rebels charged. From every corner of the camp they rose. Jessa led a group from the left side, hurling flaming oil at the machines. Swung a giant metal hook he had crafted from a tractor arm, cutting through one of the soldiers' suits. Children ran through tunnels, spreading confusion, setting off traps. The fight was chaos. The rebels had no armor, no shields, but they had numbers, surprise, and fury. For every one of them that fell, two more pushed forward. Lyra moved like fire herself, shouting orders, helping the wounded, dragging people from blasts, never stopping. Her hands were burned, her knees bleeding, but she kept going. She picked up a weapon from a fallen enemy and fought with it until the charge failed. Then she grabbed a pipe and kept swinging. Hours passed like heartbeats. The camp was burning. Bodies, human and alien, lay across the dust. The coalition, stunned by the resistance, sent in more troops, but even they began to falter. Their scans failed, their maps were wrong, their machines broke down in the traps. They had planned for fear, hadn't planned for unity. And when a second wave of coalition ships tried to land on the east side, they were met with a wall. A fire made from fuel and scrap that the rebels had hidden. The ships couldn't land. The soldiers on the ground were stranded. Then, something no one expected happened. One of the younger guards, barely older than a boy, threw down his weapon and raised his hands. He shouted something in his own tongue. But the meaning was clear. He didn't want to fight anymore. Few more followed him. Confusion spread. The commander roared orders, but the cracks had already formed. And Illyra saw it. Their grip was slipping. The rebels pressed harder. They didn't have much left, only hope and grit. But it was enough. As the sun began to fall behind the hills, the last of the soldiers pulled back, dragging their wounded with them. Their ships roared as they lifted off, disappearing into the smoke-choked sky. The rebels stood among the ruins, panting, bloodied but alive. Illyra dropped to her knees, not from pain, not from fear, but from relief. They had done it. They had defended the camp. Her children were still breathing, and so were hundreds of others. The coalition had expected to break them. Instead, they had woken something ancient and unstoppable. Hunger had united them. Pain had shaped them. Love had turned them into warriors. And now the stars knew. These people would never be silent again. Ash covered everything like a second skin. The camp stood in ruins, half burned and half buried under broken walls and fallen machines. But inside those ruins, life stirred. Lyra moved through the shattered paths with slow, steady steps, helping. Lift debris, pulling out survivors. Guiding the wounded toward the healing tents they had patched together with old blankets and stolen medical crates. Her back ached, her arms were scratched and raw, but her eyes were sharp. People looked to her now, not with pity, not with silent questions, but with trust. She had become something more than a leader. She was a symbol of what had survived. The coalition hadn't returned. Not yet. After the last attack failed and their soldiers were driven back, They had retreated into orbit to regroup. Everyone knew they would return, stronger and angrier. But that fear no longer ruled the camp. Instead, they used every hour to prepare. Caro worked day and night with the team to repair what they could, strengthening the walls, setting traps with better timing, using the remains of broken drones to build tracking eyes that would warn of movement in the skies. Jessa, her hands, still scarred from the oil fire, trained volunteers to fight with blades and slings and even bare hands. The children ran messages, carried food, and helped with building. No one was useless. Everyone gave something. And the biggest change was this. People from other camps started arriving. First a few, then dozens, then more. They came with hollow cheeks, tired feet, and stories of how word had spread. A woman on a mining moon said her guard had trembled when he spoke of a camp that fought back. A trader whispered that the higher commanders were furious, unsure how to handle the spark. That's what they called it now, the spark. What Alira had started, what had set fire to the idea that the oppressed didn't have to stay broken. The newcomers brought supplies, skills, hope. They shared everything they had. One man arrived with an old transmitter and said he could connect to deep channels. They built a tall antenna wrapped in wire, powered by stolen energy cores. And for the first time, they spoke to other rebel voices in the stars. The network was weak, scattered, and full of static, but it was real. They weren't alone anymore. Every night, around the fire pit rebuilt at the center, people told their stories. One mother said she used to hide her baby in a trash bin when patrols came. A teenager described how he sabotaged fuel lines with nothing but a wrench. They cried together, laughed softly, and held each other like family. Alira sat with Nala and Rix beside her, both older now, in years, but in eyes. Rix had stopped pretending to be a soldier. Didn't need to. He had become one in his own way. Nala had taken to carrying a small book where she wrote every person's name who helped rebuild. She said their stories mattered, that they would never be forgotten. Alira agreed. One morning, a scout rushed in from the southern hills. Coalition drones had been spotted again, this time in larger numbers. The people didn't panic. They prepared. Lyra climbed the tower once more and looked across the camp, not at its damage, but at its strength. Beneath the broken roofs were people who had found courage. The dust-covered tunnels were voices that had learned to sing again. Above them all, the wind carried no cries of fear, only the sound of hammers, whispers, and steady footsteps. The coalition would return. Of course they would. But what waited for them now was not a starving crowd begging for mercy. It was a force made of unity, sacrifice, and the deep, unstoppable fire of mothers, fathers, children, and strangers who had chosen to stand together. Illyra touched her chest, where a small pendant rested, the only thing she had left from the life before. She whispered a quiet promise to the stars. Whatever came next, they would not kneel, they would not break. The world had forgotten them. But they would become the story the galaxy would never forget. The sky turned black with ships as the coalition returned, louder and heavier than before, filling the air with the scream of vengeance and the thud of armored feet hitting the ground. But this time, the rebels were not waiting in fear. They were ready. Illyra stood at the edge of the camp beside Caro, who had wrapped his arm in bandages but still held his giant iron hook. Nala stood just behind them, clutching the list of names, her eyes focused, no longer the quiet child she once was. And Rix, barely old enough to be called a fighter, had a sling over his shoulder and a fire in his chest. They had spent days building defenses, hiding messages, warning other camps, and now, all across the broken zone, groups like theirs had lit their own fires. The camp was no longer alone. The first wave came: fast drones, foot soldiers, flamethrowers. They struck hard, hitting the south gate with missiles and smoke. But instead of panic, the rebels triggered a maze of traps, collapsing tunnels, gas bursts from sealed pipes, and trenches filled with metal scraps that turned vehicles upside down. Screams filled the air, but this time, they weren't just from the rebels. The enemy began to fall back, confused by the traps and ambushes from hidden fighters in every corner. Lyra moved quickly through the field, helping the wounded and shouting signals. She wore a band of red cloth around her arm so her people could spot her easily. The cloth had once been her daughter's. Now it was her flag. As the battle raged, more camps joined the fight. Smoke signals and light flashes called for help and answered it. From the northern ridge came a group of miners who had armed themselves with drills and fuel tanks. From the west arrived a gang of desert scouts on broken skimmers, shooting fire from stolen blasters. The coalition didn't know how to handle it. What was once one broken labor camp had turned into a growing rebellion that could not be contained. Communication lines were jammed. Enemy orders were lost. Their soldiers started turning on each other out of fear. And then something even more powerful happened. In the middle of the battle, a group of young coalition recruits, barely more than boys, dropped their weapons and raised their hands. They had heard stories of what had happened before. They had seen the recordings. They didn't want to fight. Alira stopped the charge when she saw them, raised her hand, and the rebels around her lowered their weapons. One by one, she walked toward the frightened soldiers, not with anger, but calm. She looked them in the eye and said only one thing: "We don't kill the lost. We teach them to stand." They were tied, disarmed, and placed in a guarded corner, not as prisoners, but as reminders of who the rebels really were. Mercy wasn't weakness. It was power. The battle lasted until the second night. Fires burned through the hills, and smoke made the stars vanish. But by the time dawn came, the enemy had pulled back again, broken and scattered. They had lost ships. They had lost men. And worse for them, they had lost control. Alira stood on the broken ramp where the last ship had tried to land. Around her, people cheered, cried, and held each other. The cost had been high, but they had survived again. And this time, the galaxy had seen it. Through the stolen transmitters, rebel camps had shared the whole battle across hundreds of channels, across distant moons and dark stations. Beings of all kinds had watched starving workers defeat an empire with nothing but scraps, love, and rage. That morning, a signal crackled through the rebel transmitter. A voice from another system spoke. "We saw you. We hear you. Out. We're with you." Alira lowered her head and smiled through the dirt and blood. She looked at Nala, who clutched the book of names tighter, and at Rix, who now stood taller than. His fear, they weren't just a spark anymore. They were a firestorm. The rebellion had begun. And nothing, no empire, no army, could put it out now. The stars above the burned hills no longer looked cold to Alira. They looked wide, like open arms calling her forward. The camp was quiet now, but not because it was empty or broken. It was quiet in the way a heart rests after beating hard and fast. Smoke still hung in the distance, and parts of the walls still leaned where fire had eaten through them. But laughter could be heard from the water well. Children ran barefoot again, their cheeks rounder than before. Old women hummed songs while making soup in blackened pots. And men who once dug graves now raised roofs. The rebels were not just surviving, they were living. Word had spread far beyond anything they imagined. Ships that were not coalition arrived at night, flying low without lights, bringing food, tools, medicine, and most importantly, people. Pilots with old war scars, engineers who had fled long ago, farmers, fighters, teachers. They came with tired eyes, but ready hands. They came because they had seen the rebellion rise and had whispered to themselves, "If they can fight, so can we." Alira had no more time for sleep. Every hour brought new decisions. Where to send food, which camp needed help, who to trust. Caro built stronger radios, with better wires, and helped repair grounded transports. Jessa now trained fighters not just from one camp, but from 12. And Nala's book had grown thick, Kit's pages filled with names of those who gave, built, protected, or fell. Rix worked beside the mechanics, learning how to fix the old engines. His hands were stained black now, but his heart had healed. Night, Alira climbed the water tower once more. She looked out and saw lights stretching far into the dark hills. Each one was a rebel camp, each one a home. The coalition hadn't returned. Rumors said they were preparing something bigger. Full assault. one that would crush all resistance in one strike. But Alira didn't fear them anymore, 'cause now they were no longer alone. The next morning, a strange signal came through one, not from the rebels, but from deep space. It was not a warning, not a threat. It was a message spoken in many tongues. It said, "We watched. We believed you were broken. You were wrong. Your fight is heard. We offer alliance." It was from a neutral trade planet, a powerful one. And soon after, more came. A system of desert moons said they would no longer fuel coalition ships. A scientist group from a floating city offered drone shields. A whole colony of exiles pledged. Warriors. The rebellion had become a movement. Alira met with her closest friends beneath the tree that had grown in the ruins of the old kitchen. They sat together no longer, just a few rebels, but leaders of something larger than they had ever dreamed. "What now?" Caro asked. "We teach," Alira said. "We don't just fight. We teach others how to rise, how to live again." So they did. They trained healers, builders, and messengers. They built schools, not just trenches. They passed on what hunger and fire had taught them. They planted food in places once burned. They treated surrendered enemies as people, not trophies. Grew not just stronger, but kinder. And one day, when Alira walked into a training ground and saw a young girl teaching others how to throw oil jars, just like she once had a hitter, the fight had never been about her, or the camp, or revenge. It had been about the children, the ones who would grow up free. So when the stars blinked again with the threat of more war, the people no longer looked up with fear, they looked up. With readiness, the galaxy had seen their hunger. Now it would see their strength. The fire had spread and it would never die. Not as long as one voice still whispered, "We are not yours to break."